Hello everyone, today we will be discussing the chapter Traders, Kings and Pilgrims. Earlier I was using the new edition where this chapter was listed as chapter 9, but in the older version it appears as chapter 10. This chapter delves into the significance of trade, religious pilgrimages and the rise of powerful kingdom in ancient India. It highlights a period where India boasted active trade routes, flourishing empires, and attracted people from across the world who came for trade, learning, and religious reasons. The chapter emphasizes the cultural exchanges that occurred through these interactions. India's influence spread widely through trade and religion, while India also absorbed ideas, custom, and tradition from other cultures, fostering a blend of diverse practices. This exchange was not limited to goods, but it also included ideas, art, literature, and religions, which contributed to making the Indian subcontinent a vibrant cultural center. First, let's talk about the Nadan black polished ware. This fine glossy pottery, especially in the form of bowls and plates, was discovered at several archaeological sites across the Indian subcontinent. The question that arises is, how did these pottery items spread so far? One plausible explanation is trade. Traders played a significant role in the spread of NPBW, that is, Nadan black polished ware. The pottery likely produced in specific regions of India was carried by these traders to various parts of the subcontinent. This trade, both by land and sea, was an essential element of the ancient economy. Traders who traveled by caravan, moving goods through established routes across the northern and central regions of India. Coastal regions also participated in this trade through sea routes. Ports along the western and eastern coast served as the hub for the export of goods to distant lands. Moving on to the another aspect of ancient trade, let's focus on South India, which was renowned for its rich resources. South India was famous for its gold, spices, especially pepper, and precious stone. These commodities were highly sought after by foreign traders, particularly from the Roman Empire. Pepper, often referred to as black gold, was especially prized in Rome, where it became an essential part of their diet and trade. The Roman Empire had a significant demand for pepper, and South India was one of the main producers of these valuable spices. Now you might wonder, how did Roman traders manage to acquire these goods? The answer lies in the robust trade routes that existed between India and the Roman Empire. Traders from the Roman Empire sailed across the Indian Ocean, arriving at Indian ports along the west coast, such as Arikamedu and Muziris, to purchase spices, pearls, and other treasures. These Roman merchants, in return, brought along gold coins as payment. Some of these goods were also carried overland through Silk Route or other overland trade routes connecting the Roman world with the subcontinent. The movement of goods was not one way. In return for the spices and precious stones, Roman gold coins were found in large numbers in South India, especially in places like Kerala and Tamil Nadu. The discovery of these coins provide direct evidence of trade relation between India and Rome during ancient times. The Roman Empire had a high demand for Indian spices and other luxury goods. Since their economy was heavily based on trade, the Romans needed to pay for the goods they received from India. As gold was highly valued both in the Roman Empire and India, Roman merchants carried gold coins to trade for Indian goods, especially spices like pepper. Here a poem about how trade was happening in those is written. Do read it and try to answer the given questions. Trade in ancient times used several sea routes to connect trade across vast distances. Some of these routes followed the coast, while others crossed the open sea like the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal. These sea routes were crucial for connecting regions that were far apart, such as the subcontinents, East Africa, Arabia, and the Southeast Asia. The monsoon winds played a significant role in shaping ancient maritime trade. These winds, which changed directions with the season, were crucial for sailors navigating long distances across the seas. If sailors wanted to travel from East Africa or Arabia to the western coast of the Indian subcontinent, they would sail with the southwest monsoon, which blows from the southwest towards the northeast during the summer months, roughly from June to September. These wind directions would help them travel more quickly and with less effort. For journeys in the opposite direction, such as from the subcontinent to the Arabian Peninsula or East Africa, sailors would take advantage of the northeast monsoon, which blows from the northeast towards the southwest, especially during the winter months. By understanding and utilizing these monsoon patterns, traders could plan their voyage to avoid adverse winds and ensure faster and safer travel. Moving on to the next topic, that is New Kingdom along the coast. South India is blessed with diverse geography that influence its settlements, agriculture and trade. The fertile Kaveri River Valley is especially important, highlighting the significance of rivers for agriculture and sustenance. Let's see what the term Muvendra means. Muvendar. Let's see what the term Muvendar means. Muvendar refers to three major Tamil ruling dynasties of the time, the Cholas, Cheras and Pandyas. These kingdoms were powerful in South India, and the word Muvendar literally means three chiefs in Tamil, representing the heads of these ruling families. These three kingdoms control both inland and coastal areas, with their capitals and the centers of power spread across different regions. Each of the three dynasties had two centers of power, one located inland and other on the coast. This allowed them to control trade routes, manage agriculture and exert military influence. Two cities that were especially important were Pohar or Kaveripatnam. The coastal port of the Cholas was a thriving center of maritime trade. Madurai, the capital of the Pandyas, was an important inland city, central to their administration and the economy. The chiefs did not collect regular taxes. Instead, they demanded gifts from the people and engaged in military expedition to collect tribute from neighboring regions. This tribute system and the emphasis on wealth distribution highlight the economic structure of these kingdoms. The chief also rewarded poets for composing praising poems, offering them golds, precious stones, or horses, elephant, and fine cloth. This illustrates the cultural patronage system and the importance of art and literature during this period. The Satavahanas were a prominent dynasty that ruled over western India, which is present-day Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, Andhra Pradesh, and Karnataka around the 1st century CE to 3rd century CE. Gautamiputra Sri Satkarni is the most important ruler of this dynasty, often referred for his military achievement and his role in expanding the Satavahana Empire. Gautamiputra Sri Satkarni and the Satavahanas were known as the Lords of Dakshinapath, which refers to the southern region or the southern trade route. This indicates that the Satavahana had significant influence over the south and were instrumental in controlling the vital trade routes that led to southern India. The coastal region of India, especially along the western, that is Gujarat and Konkan, and eastern, which is Coromandel coast, were significant military zones. By controlling these coasts, Gautamiputra Sri Satkarni could secure his empire's border, protect against foreign invasion, and maintain internal stability. The coasts were crucial for maritime trade. By controlling the western and eastern coastal region, Satkarni could dominate major trade routes, facilitating the flow of goods, cultural exchanges, and wealth. Cities like Kalyani, Bharuch, Puhar, and Muziris were major important port towns during this time. Control over these ports meant control over trade with the Roman Empire, Southeast Asia, and the East Africa, boosting the economic power of the Satavahanas. The coastal region were hub for international trade. By controlling ports, Satkarni could gain access to valuable imports like Roman glassware, wine, and gold, and also control the export of Indian goods such as spices, cotton, silk, gems, and ivory. The Dakshinapath or southern route connected trade routes between the northern and southern region of India, and also with the Indian Ocean Trade Network. The Dakshinapath or southern route connected trade routes between the northern and southern region of India, and also with the Indian Ocean Trade Network. The control of such routes would significantly contribute to the wealth and prosperity of his empire. By exerting influence over coastal areas, Gautamiputra Sri Satkarni could expand the cultural and political influence of the Satavahana dynasty. By exerting influence over coastal areas, Gautamiputra Sri Satkarni could expand the cultural and political influence of the Satavahana dynasty. The coastal regions, especially the port towns, were also centers of cultural exchange and learning. Establishing dominance over these coasts helped the Satavahanas strengthen their legitimacy and cultural identity. often reflected in the inscription and patronage of art, architecture, and literature. Coastal region typically had a thriving economy due to their involvement in trade. By controlling these coasts, Gautamiputra Sri Satkarni could ensure regular revenue stream from custom duties on imports and export. Coastal cities were often directly involved in naval trade with distant land, and their wealth contributed to the overall prosperity of the empire. I think this answers the question, why do you think he wanted to control the coast? Now the next section is the story of the Silk Route. The Silk Route is crucial for understanding ancient trade networks, which is an important topic in the history section of the UPPCS prelims. While the passage focuses on China, the Indian subcontinent also played a significant role in the Silk Route trade. Indian merchants were involved in trading silk, spices, cotton, and other luxury goods between India, China, and Rome. Silk is a luxurious fiber that is highly valued due to its smooth texture, rich colors. The passage explains the complicated process of silk production, starting from extracting silk from silkworms, spinning it into threads, and then weaving it into fabric. This connects to ancient Indian economy, as silk was one of the major exports of ancient India and was highly sought after, especially in trade. The invention of silk is attributed to China around 7,000 years ago. For centuries, silk making technique were a closely guarded secret in China. However, traders and missionaries who traveled along the Silk Route helped spread the knowledge of silk making to the West. The Silk Route, also known as the Silk Road, was not a single road, but rather a network of trade routes connecting China, Central Asia, West Asia with Europe. The passage highlights how silk became an important trade good along these routes, where it was transported across mountains, desert, and dangerous road. This trade route played a significant role in cultural exchange and the spread of goods and knowledge. Silk Road was not a single road, but rather a network of trade routes connecting China, Central Asia, and the West Asia with Europe. Chinese rulers sent gifts to rulers of Iran and West Asia, and this is how the knowledge of silk spread further west. Over time, Rome became a significant consumer of silk, but it remained expensive due to the long and dangerous journey it had to undertake from China. As the Silk Route passed through different regions, people living along the routes often demanded payments from traders for passing through their lands. This represents the economic significance of controlling trade routes and the impact of regional rulers in facilitating or taxing trade. The Kushans, who ruled over Central Asia and the Northwest India around 2000 years ago, were among the best known rulers to control the Silk Route. Their rule spanned significant regions including Peshawar, Mathura, and Takshila, which were the key centers of power along the route. These areas facilitated crucial trade between China, India, and the Roman Empire. The Kushans, who ruled over Central Asia and the Northwest India around 2000 years ago, were among the best known rulers to control the Silk Route. Their rule spanned significant regions including Peshawar, Mathura, and Takshila, which were the key centers of power along the route. These areas facilitated crucial trade between China, India, and the Roman Empire. The Kushans enabled the flow of goods, including silk, from the east to the west by controlling a section of the Silk Route that extended from Central Asia to the seaport at the mouth of the Indus River, where silk was shipped westward. The Kushans were also pioneers in issuing gold coins, which played a vital role in trade. These coins were used by the traders across the Silk Route, promoting economic integration between distant civilizations. The Silk Route was not only controlled by Kushans, it was a network of trade routes used by many other powers over the centuries. Control of key regions along the route was crucial for gaining access to wealth generated by this extensive trade, including luxury goods like silk, spices, and precious stones. Central Asian nomadic tribes, along with other dynasties in India, Persia, and China, also exerted influence over different sections of the route at various times. By managing such a strategically located region, the Kushan ensured that they could play a significant role in the economic and cultural exchanges between East and West. The control of the Silk Route not only brought wealth to the rulers but also led to the exchange of ideas, culture, and technologies across vast distances. The Kushans were integral to maintaining these connections between Roman Empire and China, two of the most powerful civilizations at the time. Now, there is one question is given here. Why do you think it would have been difficult to use carts along the Silk Route? Carts would have faced difficulty crossing narrow and winding mountain passes or shifting sands in desert, making it more practical to use pack animals like camels, horses, and mules instead, which are better suited to these environments. Transporting silk by sea was generally faster and could carry larger quantities of goods compared to overland sea routes, which were much slower due to the challenges of land travel. Ships could travel long distances across bodies of water, including the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea, connecting ports like those at the mouth of the Indus River and facilitating trade to Roman ports in the Mediterranean. One major problem with the sea transport was the risk of piracy and attacks from hostile forces. Ships carrying valuable goods like silk would have been vulnerable to theft and destruction. Now, the next topic is the spread of Buddhism. Kanishka's reign is significant for several reasons, especially his patronage of Buddhism and the cultural development during his rule. One of the key achievements of the Kanishka was the Buddhist council he organized, which is often referred to as the Fourth Buddhist Council. The council took place in Kundala which is called as Kashmir now, during his reign. The council was significant because it sought to resolve doctrinal issues within the Buddhism. Scholars and monks met to discuss important matters of Buddhist philosophy and doctrine, especially the growing divide between Mahayana and Hinayana. The division had profound implication on the spread of Buddhism in India and beyond. Kanishka's support for Buddhism made him one of the most important patrons of the religion in ancient India. His role in organizing the council helped consolidate Mahayana as a major school of Buddhist thought. Ashwaghosha, a prominent poet and scholar at Kanishka's court, composed the Buddha Charita, a biography of Buddha. This text is one of the earliest works of Sanskrit literature focused on the life and teaching of Buddha. Ashwaghosha's work is also significant in the context of cultural history, as they mark the beginning of the trend of writing important religious and the philosophical text in Sanskrit, which was the language of intellectual and cultural elite in India during this time. This shift to Sanskrit was essential for the spread of Buddhist teaching beyond India. As Buddhism spread to other regions such as Central Asia, China, and Southeast Asia, Sanskrit became an important vehicle for cultural exchange. Earlier, in early Buddhism, the Buddha was not represented in human form in the art. Instead, symbols were used to represent his presence. For example, the peepal tree symbolized the Buddha's enlightenment, and other symbols like footprints or a wheel symbolized his teaching. However, with the rise of Mahayana Buddhism, the Buddha began to be depicted in statues. This was a major shift in Buddhist art. These statues became a central feature of Buddhist worship and spread across region, particularly in places like Mathura, Takshila. These locations became important center for the production of Buddha statue. Another significant development within Mahayana Buddhism was the belief in Bodhisattva. A Bodhisattva is a being who has achieved enlightenment but chooses to remain in the world to help others attain enlightenment, rather than entering nirvana and isolating themselves from the suffering of the world. This was a departure from the earlier teaching of Hinayana Buddhism, where the focus was on the individual enlightenment and the detachment from the world. Bodhisattva were viewed as compassionate beings who actively work for the benefit of all sentient beings. This idea greatly appealed to many followers and became a popular aspect of Mahayana Buddhism. The worship of Bodhisattva became widespread, not only in India but also in Central Asia, China, and eventually Korea and Japan. As these regions adopted Mahayana Buddhism, they also embraced the idea of Bodhisattva as a central figure in Buddhist teaching and worship. The rise of Mahayana Buddhism and the shift to depicting the Buddha in human form marked a significant cultural and religious change in India and beyond. This made Buddhism more accessible to ordinary people, as they could now worship a tangible image of Buddha. The concept of the Bodhisattva introduced the idea of universal compassion and altruism, which expanded the appeal of Buddhism and allowed it to attract followers from the diverse social background. In western and southern India, numerous caves were carved into hills to serve as monastic dwellings for Buddhist monks. These caves, found in regions like Ajanta, Ellora, and Karle, are not just places of meditation but also centers of Buddhist life. Some were built at the orders of kings and queens, while others were commissioned by merchants and farmers. This shows that Buddhism wasn't just supported by royalty but also by common people who valued its teaching. Many of these caves were located near the Western Ghat, especially at key passes through the mountains. These locations were strategically important because they lay along trade routes connecting prosperous ports on the coast with cities in the Deccan region. Merchants traveling with these routes would stop at these monasteries, likely for rest and spiritual solace. This connection between Buddhism and trade shows how the religion spread not just through the missionaries but also through the daily lives of people involved in commerce. Buddhism journey did not stop in India. It spread eastward to countries like Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Thailand, and Indonesia. In this region, the form of Buddhism that gained prominence was Theravada Buddhism, often referred to as the teachings of the elders. This older form of Buddhism focused on the original teachings of the Buddha and emphasized personal enlightenment through monastic life and meditation. In Southeast Asia, Theravada Buddhism became the dominant school of thought. It provided a framework for social and spiritual life, influencing the culture, politics, and art of the region. The spread of Theravada Buddhism is a key example of how religious ideas can take root in new culture, adapting and evolving based on local needs and traditions. So, the spread of Buddhism from the caves of India to the shores of Southeast Asia wasn't just about the diffusion of religious teaching. It was deeply tied to the political patronage, trade, and the social fabric of ancient societies. As we study this history, we gain a deeper understanding of how religions evolved and shaped the world around them. Now, I think you can answer the question how Buddhism spread to these lands. Overall, the spread of Buddhism was a gradual process that occurred through both direct missionaries' effort and indirect cultural exchange. The religion adapted to local contexts, leading to the rise of different schools of thought such as Theravada Buddhism in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, Mahayana Buddhism in other parts of Asia. Now the next topic is the quest of the pilgrims. The Chinese Buddhist pilgrims such as Fahyang, Xinjiang, and Itsing played a significant role in spreading Buddhist teaching across Asia. Their travel are an example of how Buddhism was transmitted to China and beyond, not just through written text but also through physical relics and cultural exchange. These pilgrims were instrumental in ensuring the Buddhist text and teachings and they were carried across border, which led to the further dissemination of Buddhism in East Asia. The pilgrims did not just visit places associated with Buddha's life, they also visited Buddhist monasteries, which were crucial centers of learning. Their journey was as much as about religious devotion as it was about scholarly exchange, which highlights the dual nature of Buddhist pilgrimage, both as a spiritual quest and as a scholarly mission. Fahyang traveled to India in the early 5th century to obtain Buddhist texts and to study under the Indian scholars. His writing gave us insight into the religion and the political condition in India at the time. Xinjiang, whose journey is one of the most famous, is also notable for his detailed records. His writing, known as the Great Tang Records on the Western region, offer detailed description of India during the 7th century, including a state of Buddhism, its monasteries, and social life. Zhang's journey back to the China involved not only physical relics such as the statues of Buddha made of gold, silver, and sandalwood, but also over 600 manuscripts. These manuscripts were loaded on the backs of 20 horses, showing the immense value and the volume of Buddhist knowledge he brought back to China. This is significant because these texts include translation of important Buddhist scripture from Sanskrit into Chinese. His efforts greatly enriched the intellectual and religious landscape in China. The capsizing of the boat on the Indus River, which caused the loss of over 50 manuscripts, underscores the dangers these pilgrims faced on their journey. These setbacks, however, did not stop Zhenjiang. He continued his mission to translating the remaining manuscript into Chinese, making an immense contribution to the spread and preservation of Buddhist teaching in China. The Silk Route and other trade routes were not just for commerce but also for the spread of ideas. Xinjiang travel along the land route through Central Asia and Northwest India highlight the interconnectedness of ancient civilization and how Buddhism traveled through these well-established trade and cultural routes. This passage from Xinjiang account provides rich detail about Nalanda University, which was one of the most renowned centers of Buddhist learning during ancient times. The description highlights both the academic and spiritual environment of Nalanda, which is why it attracted scholars like Xinjiang. Let's break down the reason why Xinjiang would have wanted to study there. Xinjiang mentions that the teachers are men of the highest abilities and talent, which indicates that Nalanda was home to the distinguished scholars and learned monks. As a scholar seeking deep understanding, he was likely attracted by the quality of the intellectual environment in Nalanda, where he could stay under the guidance of renowned experts and expand his knowledge of Buddhism and other subjects. The passage mentions the rules of the monastery are strict and that everyone had to follow them. For a dedicated student like Xinjiang, the discipline and the structure offered by Nalanda would be an ideal environment for serious study and spiritual development. Strict rules might have also ensured a focused, uninterrupted environment for learning and meditation. He noticed that the discussions are held throughout the day and that the old and the young mutually helped one another. This indicates an environment where intellectual exchange was constant and encouraged. Nalanda was a place for dialogue, debate, and critical thinking, which would have been particularly attractive for someone like Xinjiang, who sought it to deepen his understanding of Buddhist philosophy and teachings. The passage mentions that the gatekeeper asked new entrants difficult questions, and only those who can answer them are allowed to enter. This strict entrance test ensured that only the most dedicated and knowledgeable student could study at Nalanda. Now the next topic is the beginning of Bhakti. This passage discusses the beginning of Bhakti and its significance in the development of Hinduism. It highlights the rise of personal devotion to deities like Shiva, Vishnu, and various goddesses, and how this shift influenced the evolution of religious practices in India. During this period, the worship of specific deities like Shiva, Vishnu, and goddesses such as Durga gained importance. This indicates a shift in religious practices toward the personal worship of deities, which became a central feature of later Hinduism. Bhakti is defined as a person's devotion to a chosen deity. The concept emphasizes that anyone, regardless of social status, high or low caste, rich or poor, man or woman, could engage in devotion. This makes Bhakti a democratic form of worship, accessible to all. The Bhagavad Gita provides an early example of Bhakti through the dialogue between Krishna and Arjun. In the Gita, Krishna instructs Arjun to abandon all other duties and take refuge in him alone, signifying the supreme power of devotion. Krishna promises that devotion will free the devotee from evil and suffering. Bhakti allowed for the deities to be imagined in any form, be it human, animal, or natural elements like a tree. This flexibility in representation led to the creation of beautiful images of God and goddesses, showing the interaction between religion and art, making the experience deeply personal. The beginning of Bhakti marks an important shift in the religious landscape of India. Bhakti's emphasis on devotion over ritual, the inclusivity of its followers, and the flexibility in deity worship led to the significant change in Hindu practices and paved the way for later development in Hinduism and Indian culture. Let's see what was happening in other parts of the world. Around 2000 years ago, Christianity emerged in West Asia with the teachings of Jesus Christ, who was born in Bethlehem, which was a part of Roman Empire. Jesus thought that he was the savior. Jesus taught that he was the savior of the world, and he emphasized love, kindness, and mutual trust. His teaching, like the Beatitudes in the Bible, called for values such as righteousness, mercy, purity of heart, and peacefulness. Jesus' message resonated with the ordinary people and soon spread across West Asia, Africa, and Europe, Within 100 years of his death, early Christian missionaries from West Asia traveled to the west coast of the Indian subcontinent to spread his teachings. These missionaries laid the foundation of Christianity in India. The Syrian Christians of Kerala are among the oldest Christian community in the world. They are called Syrian Christian because they likely trace their origin to Christian missionaries from West Asia. This community has deep roots in the region and has preserved many traditions that reflect their ancient connection with the Christianity's early spread. Let us start with the exercise. Now the first one is match the following. First is Movendar. Now as you can see, it is been already done in the book, but let me tell you. Movendar means Chola, Cheras and Pandyas, lord of the Dakshinapath, meaning Satavahanas, rulers. Next is Aswaghosha. He is related to Buddha Charita. Bodhisattva, Mahayana Buddhism. Zunjiang, he was a Chinese pilgrim. The next question is, why did king wanted to control the Silk Route? The Silk Route connected India, China, Central Asia and the Middle East, Europe. It was used to trade silk, spices, precious stone, horses, gold and luxury goods. By controlling the trade route meant taxing traders, which brought huge revenue to the kingdom. The Silk Route passed through the important mountain passes and river valleys. Control of these points gave military and political advantage. It helped ruler monitor movement, protect border and influence neighboring region. Now it was cities along the routes like Delhi, Samarkand, Bukhara became the rich and cosmopolitan. Now trade created jobs for craftsmen, merchant, caravan leaders. It encouraged the growth of markets and towns in the kingdom. The Silk Route wasn't just for good, it also helped spread religions, ideas and invention, art, book and knowledge. Now the rulers who controlled it gained cultural prestige and access to new technologies. Now dominating the Silk Route gave a ruler international influence. Other kingdoms and traders depended on safe passage through the regions, which increased the ruler's status and diplomatic power. Now what kind of evidence do historians use to find out about the trade and trade routes? Historians study trade and trade routes by reading the writings of travelers, merchants and officials that describes goods, routes and trade center. Now archaeological finds also give the idea about history. Objects like pottery, coins, seals and ruins of ports and markets found at excavation sites. Now coins also help identify trade connection, ruling powers and accepted currencies. Now maps and geographical writings also show routes and cities involved in trade. Now shipwrecks also reveal international sea trade through recovered goods. Now the next question is, what were the main features of Bhakti? Now we have already discussed enough. I think you are in a good position to write this answer. Now in the next video, we will start with the new chapter, that is New Empires and Kingdoms. Thank you.